Hello everybody, and today I will be reviewing the entire Imperial Japanese Navy line in War Thunder. Now, this is going to be a long video. I will do timestamps if you're curious about specific ships or if you want to skip others that you have passed over. And as a caveat, I will also be only reviewing the researchable ships. I'm not going to do any of the premiums. I am going to review Shimakaze because technically you can research that. Hatsuharu does not count because I think that event might be over, so people might not be able to get it anymore. And so that one won't be getting reviewed this time. But most of the premium ships are pretty close to their researchable counterparts, so maybe it'll help some people make their choice. If they want to buy them or not, that is. Other caveats I want to go over before I start this. Most ships will be reviewed based on having most of their modifications researched or fully spaded. The review will typically be in order of speed and handling, then survivability, anti-aircraft, the firepower in general, their torpedo loadout because the Japanese line is pretty torpedo intensive, and a rating. The rating is based on my experience with each ship and how much fun they were for me to grind out. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that if I don't mention anti-aircraft firepower on a certain ship, it's most likely because that ship has very little or none, so it wasn't even worth mentioning. Now, getting on with the review of the line, I wanted to do a brief line overview, just highlighting some of the characteristics of the line and some of the things it could be missing. As per the missing component, there's a couple ships that I've noticed are absent from the line or possibilities that could be coming. The absentees from the line are two heavy cruisers, namely the Miyoko class, which interestingly is a premium at a very curious battle rating compared to the rest of the line, but that's neither here nor there for this video. And the other heavy cruiser that's missing would be the Kako class, so there is a bit of space for the line to grow in the middle. They may add in a couple extra ships for people to play later on. As for future ships on the heavier end of the line, I'm curious where they'll go with their battleships before they get to Yamato. Whether they add in like an early Tosa or Amagi class, just pre-carrier configurations or what they would have looked like as battleships and battle cruisers, just to extend the line out a little bit more before they end it with Musashi and Yamato. And yes, I do list both because they do appear to be having a theme lately with Hyuga and Issei and Mutsu and probably Nagato, where they do an early version of the ships and then a late war version where they've been refit with all their anti-aircraft firepower, their armor and torpedo bulges, and so on and so forth. As for the previously mentioned Mutsu, it was added while I was recording this, so I most likely won't give it a full review, but I will do my best to give it at least a brief overview for anybody curious on my thoughts on the newly added ship. Alright, with that out of the way, I'll get into the actual characteristics of the line, and one of the first things you'll notice when you're overviewing the line is it tends to get new ship classes at lower BRs than other lines. You'll see this mainly with the heavy cruisers and the battle cruisers, with Kako and Ikoma being the two very early ships, one of them being a lot better than the other, that Japan gets way ahead of the other lines. The second thing you'll probably notice about this line is almost every ship tends to be armed with some fashion of torpedoes. It tends to be a very torpedo heavy line where it trends towards having really good torpedoes, typically with a second reload on deck for a rather quick second salvo. And this is making up for their guns. Most of them turn pretty lethargically with a very slow firing rate but really good shell velocity and accuracy on most ships. Many of the ships also have weaker armor and lower crew numbers than other lines, which tends to make you really less survivable, so you definitely don't want to be charging in with these ships most of the time. And most ships are extremely fast and maneuverable, further helping you kite the enemy team. Most of the ships are also pretty weak in the anti-aircraft department. Even the decently protected ones have very low range on their anti-aircraft, and they don't have a lot of alpha strike capability to keep the planes away from you. Most likely, if they are going to kill the plane that's coming after you, it's going to be as a revenge kill. Another key point with this line are their destroyers. These things are terrifying if you bring them up to top tier. Especially with the Type 93s, you will find that they will absolutely devastate most battleships that you see at the 7.0 battle rating. And it's absolutely laughable to bring them up there sometimes. As for other ships in the line, Ikoma is by far the weakest battlecruiser / dreadnought in the game, with only 2 twin main battery guns, and they are bad. I think it's actually the only ship with 2 main battery turrets such as this, and it tends to struggle. It would be, I believe, like the USN having the South Carolina class in the game. It is not fun to play at all, and you'll see that in the review where I get into more detail. But TLDR, it's a very good line for experienced players in my opinion. The new players may suffer because of the torpedo dependency and the lethargic fire rate and turn rate of the guns, and because most of the ships aren't frontline ships and aren't made to take heavy damage, unlike some of the other lines. Alright, before we get into each ship in its own, I just want to mention that I am going to terribly mispronounce most of these, as I am American and I'm not great with the dialect, but I will try my best and feel free to make fun of me for my mistakes. So starting off the Japanese line, we have the destroyer Momi at 3.3. This ship actually wasn't added when I first started. I actually started the line off with Mutsuki, and so it wasn't completely modified for me, but it did have the necessary ones for me to make the review. This destroyer is very fast and maneuverable, but it pays for it in its firepower. It has very slow turrets, only 3 guns overall, which is pretty painful at these low tiers, a very low rate of fire, and pretty poor firing arcs, which is not going to help you dodge around enemy fire while returning with your own, obviously. You would think the torpedoes would make up for it, and while they are decent torpedoes, the destroyer doesn't have a lot of them mounted on it, and their explosive yield is pretty small, so it might not actually kill the ship that you fired them at. So it kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth when you're starting off this Japanese line, as per starting it off with a pretty meh ship overall. So my rating on this one's going to be a 3 out of 10. It is a starter, but it's pretty painful overall. And next up is the Mutsuki, the destroyer that I actually started this line off on. This destroyer is very fast, though not as maneuverable as its predecessor. The turrets are still slow with their low rate of fire, which is a fairly common theme for the Japanese line, but they have been improved with great firing arcs, which helps you when you're maneuvering out of the line of fire of the enemy destroyers that do beat you in the reload department. The torpedoes on the Mutsuki are also pretty great for the tier. They are very fast and very damaging with a fairly quick reload, but they do also have bad angles of fire, so there is some give and take there. This destroyer is definitely more on par with other destroyers at the tier than its predecessor Momi is, so I'm going to give it a rating of 6 out of 10 because this one actually teaches you the strengths and the weaknesses of the Japanese destroyer line. And then we get to 4.0 with the Ayanami. This destroyer is a bit slower than Mutsuki, but it is still quite fast for the tier. It is the first Japanese destroyer with 127mm guns, which is a theme you will see continued through the rest of them. They do have a slow rate of fire, but that's pretty standard for the 127mm, and it does have a very slow traverse speed on the ship. These guns do only get HE shells, so you won't be penetrating too far into enemy destroyers if they have any semblance of armor, so they're a lot better off at taking out the enemy guns and surface mounts versus their internals. The torpedoes on this are also great for the tier. but also bad angles. They tend to get blocked by the lifeboats mounted on the sides of the ship. And while this is a pretty good setup for a destroyer, it faces quick firing destroyers that it can't really compete with unless it gets lucky with the torpedo strike. So overall, I'm going to give this ship a rating of 5 out of 10. I'd definitely raise the score if the torpedo angles didn't suck due to the lifeboats that are mounted on it. Meanwhile, also at 4.0, we have the JDS Harukaze. For once not an IJN ship, though still Japanese, though it might as well be a US Navy ship because it is unlike anything else in the Japanese tree. It is a very maneuverable and quick destroyer with 3 Fletcher turrets and 2 centerline mounted quad Bofors. I know they're not technically quad, but it is what it is, I said it. These guns have a great reload, decent firing arcs, and a fairly low shell velocity, so they do arc fairly high, but the highlight of this ship is the Bofors. Any ship you point these at when they're fairly close to you, say 6 kilometers, 7 kilometers, which is pretty decent for a destroyer, these things will just chew them up. They're devastating. The ship doesn't have torpedoes, like I said, it's a very standout ship in the line, and with those Bofors, other than just shooting other ships, they actually make for great anti-aircraft firepower, and so it's the first Japanese ship that actually gets a ton of anti-aircraft for the tier. In my opinion, this ship should get the USN mixture treatment, where the Bofors actually fire with the main guns. I think that would be kind of cool and help the ship out a lot, rather than do what I do and just ignore the main guns entirely and just use the Bofors, but we'll see if Wargaming decides to go back and give these ships a nice little quality of life upgrade. Overall, my rating for this ship is a 10 out of 10. Just queue up the Bofors on them and watch the enemies sink. Moving on, we have the Yugumo at 4.3. This is the first Japanese ship that gets the infamous Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which is very important for this. It is a fast destroyer but has fairly long turns. The guns have long reloads, but the turrets actually turn pretty decent for Japanese destroyers. And once again, they only get HE shells, but for the ships you are seeing, they're pretty much good enough. But the torpedoes are the highlight of the ship. Because they're Type 93s, they're fast and they're very devastating, so they will absolutely devastate anything that you come across that actually drives into one. And the only downside of this ship is if you don't have your torpedoes out and something is trying to gunfight you, you will struggle against something that has very quick firing guns. So overall, my rating for it is 8 out of 10, Type 93s for the win. Also at 4.3, we have the Hatsuharu. This ship is extremely fast and quite maneuverable in its own regard. It does lose one gun barrel, not a whole turret, just a barrel, to pick up one more torpedo over Yugumo. The guns basically feel the same as Yugumo's, and they're still only HE, but like I said, they're pretty good for anything else you're going to see at the tier. And the same OK torpedoes that you had back on the Ayanami, so they're definitely not the Type 93s. It does have two 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, but doesn't make for a great anti-aircraft package. They might chase off a couple planes, but they're definitely not going to save you. Rating, 6 out of 10. It works, but it does make you miss the Type 93s that you just experienced on the previous ship. And next up we have something fun, and that is the 4.7 battle rating Akizuki. I am going to break my standard for how I've been listing each of these reviews so far, because the highlight of this ship is the 4 dual 100mm turrets and 1 quad torpedo launcher that is loaded with Type 93s. This is a great combo for the tier. The turrets turn decently well, they have good gun arcs and a quick rate of fire, though they do only get high explosive, which being 100mm, it can be somewhat underwhelming against some of the targets you see So it does get a little painful if you're trying to find another module to damage on those ships. This ship also has a fairly effective anti-aircraft suite for a Japanese destroyer. The torpedoes themselves have a tiny firing arc because most of the space is given up to the guns, but they are worth maneuvering to fire due to them being Type 93s. This destroyer is also fast. It handles like a cruiser because of its length, so don't expect to turn fast and dodge enemy fire too much, but it can take a surprisingly amount of damage before actually sinking, so you have that going for you. My rating overall for this ship is a 9 out of 10. It only gets 1 point off for the HE being underwhelming at times against other destroyers and cruisers that you might see at the tier. Following along at the 4.7 battle rating, we have the Isuzu, the first cruiser you'll experience with the Japanese line, and it is a light cruiser that is very maneuverable and fast for its type of ship, but it definitely does not take hits well. It has basically paper armor. It boasts 3 twin 127mm guns, which have good firing angles and decent traverse speed, and a fairly decent rate of fire, but the HE shells are kinda weak and make it somewhat hard to deal damage with them. It does, however, have a massive amount of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, which makes for great anti-aircraft firepower, obviously, but they are actually very effective against destroyers and boats, and actually can be quite more effective than the main batteries. It's kind of another situation where I tended to get up close to something and just rinse them with the anti-aircraft suite rather than using those 3 main battery guns. The ship does have 2 quad torpedo launchers with Type 93s, which is great even if they're mounted one per side with okay angles, so you kind of have to spin around to use them all, so it's a little awkward because, you know, only 4 per side. Overall, my rating is 3 out of 10. It feels like a destroyer, but it's actually a pretty easy target for everybody to shoot at. And wrapping up the 4.7 battle rating is the Kako. This is one of the earliest heavy cruisers that you'll experience in game between any of the lines, and it can take hits decently well, but enough firepower will eventually find one of the magazines under its very numerous turrets, so it does have its weaknesses. It struggles against high rate of fire ships due to its weaker armor, but it is one of the first ships with a hydroplane in the IJN tree. So that is helpful, even though at this BR, most of the time the destroyers and the boats that you see everywhere will get to the caps first. Now, this cruiser is quite fast, but it does have a wide turning radius that you do have to pay attention to. This is mainly due to the speed of the cruiser and obviously the fact that it's an early heavy cruiser. As per its firepower, it has 6 single turrets with 203s, which having the 6 singles does have their benefits, but they are fairly weakly armored. They turn okay, speed-wise I should mention, but they do have somewhat poor angles if you wanted to get them all on one target. The guns do have nice velocity, massively less lead time than you needed for the light cruisers and destroyers that you have been playing, and they do have good damage and penetration, so it is quite fun to absolutely nuke something with them. The armor piercing that you get with them does tend to overpen destroyers, whereas the HE doesn't quite do enough damage with the slower rate of fire that you're dealing with on this heavy cruiser. And also the secondaries really aren't worth much outside of 5 kilometers. They definitely shouldn't be relied on. The torpedoes that are on the ship really shouldn't be bothered with. They are the underwater variant, and they're just adding to the chance for you to be detonated. My rating overall for this ship is a 6 out of 10. I do miss the torpedoes, but having the gun velocity and the Alpha Strike capability certainly makes up for it. Stepping it up to 5.0, we have the Kuma. This is a fairly fast and maneuverable ship for an early cruiser, though it does pay for that in the armor department, as it tends to struggle if it gets focus fired. As per its firepower, 6 out of the 7 guns on the ship can be broadsided due to most of them being mounted on the center line of the ship. So this is actually fairly useful for bringing everything to bear. The guns have decent angles and turning speed. The shell velocity is actually comparable to the previous heavy cruiser, and the shells are actually fairly decimating to destroyers, but if you do face off against another cruiser, they tend to struggle. The torpedoes are actually the same as the 3.3 battle rating Momi, so they're pretty poor for the higher BR. They don't have great angles, and they only get 2 double tubes per side, so while the Japanese line tends to lean towards using its torpedoes, this ship was probably better off not having them, though every once in a while you do have a use for them. Rating overall, 5 out of 10. It's fun to bully other destroyers when you're basically a bigger destroyer, as long as you don't get shot at too. Continuing on with the 5.0s, we have the Sendai. This one's going to be a rather short review because it feels like a mildly improved Kuma. It shares basically all the same characteristics per speed and firepower. The torpedoes have been slightly upgraded, but they are still poor for the tier even if they do have better angles of fire. So my overall rating for the quote-unquote improved Kuma is a 4 out of 10 because it just feels like you're grinding Kuma again, so it's not that fun. Rounding off our 5.0 lineup, we have the Shimakaze. Now this ship is a squadron research ship, so you're not actually spending your time researching it. You just earn it as long as you're in a squadron and everybody is contributing by, just playing the game. So this ship is a blast. It is one of, if not the fastest ships in the game at 93 kilometers an hour. I'm not entirely sure if the French have it beat yet, but one day I'll get through that line and find out. As per armor, the speed is your armor. You're a destroyer. At this point, your armor is not helping you that much. The ship does suffer from having wide turns due to the length of it and the speed, but it's actually fairly responsive with the rudder, so you can actually dodge a lot of fire. It is an absolute monster of a ship if you bring it up to high tier games or basically any open water matches where it can just wreak havoc with its suite of torpedoes, which I'll get into in a little bit here. But also at these high tier matches, it is great for chasing down patrol boats that really don't expect your speed. They think they're safe, zipping around the surface of the water, and then this destroyer just comes charging them down and one-shots them with their guns. Speaking of which, these are the typical Japanese destroyer guns, and while they have no AP, they do have that low arcing high explosive. It's 6 guns in total in 3 mounts with decent angles of fire and decent turning speed, so overall very useful. As per the anti-aircraft suite, since I haven't mentioned it yet, it is actually pretty decent for a Japanese destroyer, and it helps that planes have to get close to hit you due to your speed, so while they're chasing you down, your anti-aircraft gets a little bit more of a chance to take them out as well, or at least make it very hard for them to accurately drop a bomb. Now, the bread and butter of this ship is the 15 Type 93 torpedoes. They will basically one-shot anything in the game that gets hit anywhere that's not exactly on the very end of the bow or stern. These things are absolutely devastating and should not be underestimated. They come in 3 launchers of 5 each, and the launchers turn fast but have somewhat poor angles, and you have to launch them all to reload, unless that's changed in recent, but I don't think it has. So overall, this thing is a monster where you can just launch waves of torpedoes that will basically devastate anything they come across. So my rating, 10 out of 10. Let the torpedo spam commence. Shifting back to our cruisers, we have the Agano at 5.3. This cruiser is very fast and agile. It feels very much like a destroyer per its handling. But if it does have any armor on it, it doesn't work. This thing just takes damage from anything that casts a look at it sideways. And the guns don't help because it probably has some of the most underwhelming guns of the Japanese line. The 650mm guns that it has really have no velocity or penetration for anything, so you won't be neutralizing any threats that are trying to, throw shells through your very light armor. The armor piercing on this ship I found interesting because it refuses to penetrate even some destroyers, and at the same time the high explosive lacks basically any punch due to the caliber. And this ship I found fairly disappointing firepower wise at 5.3, when at the same battle rating the US Navy gets Atlanta, which is just an absolute monster for the tier. The turrets on the Agano are fast and have decent angles, but it really doesn't make up for the ship's downsides. It does get 2 centerline quad torp launchers with Type 93s. They do reload individually, but they do have pretty terrible angles, forcing you to almost be broadside when you're launching them. So overall, my rating for this ship, it gets a 2 out of 10 because it is a very, very nice looking ship, but it's just bad. Thankfully, coming off of that, we have the Furutaka at 5.7. This ship is fast and it does have very long turns, something it shared with its sister ship, Kako. And it does have fairly decent armor for the battle rating. It can shrug off a fair amount of hits that the enemy can throw at it. And it also gets torpedo bulges that will frustrate most non-Japanese ships when they, hit you with a torpedo in some very close range brawl. And it just does nothing because this ship has torpedo bulges. The turrets do turn fairly slow, and the rear turret does have a somewhat poor angle of fire, but they are fairly manageable. The shells are basically the same as you will be seeing in every Japanese cruiser from here on out, and will pen almost anything they see at the tier and have very good velocity and fairly good accuracy as well. They're actually great for aiming at engines or magazines on ships that you just want to see disappear. The secondaries on Furutaka have enough velocity to be useful within a 10-kilometer span, I'd say, but they are easily destroyed by anything that fires at you, so sometimes it's better off just to not repair them once they're hit, until obviously you take out the threat. It does get 2 quad launchers, 1 per side with Type 93s, though they do have poor angles of fire. The firepower itself can feel somewhat underwhelming against 6.0 ships that you might face, but you are workable, and it is a fairly fast ship that you can maneuver with to avoid some of their fire, while maybe you're aiming for their magazines in return. So overall, my rating is 7 out of 10. The torpedo bulges are just fun. Up next, we have a ship that might actually make me want to use the Agano instead of it, and that is the Ikoma at 5.7. This is the earliest battle cruiser in the game, and it's the only one at its tier. It doesn't see any battle cruiser or battleship at the tier it's at, and it doesn't have any other dreadnoughts to fight really. Instead it faces World War II cruisers and destroyers that just eat it alive. I mean, it does not hold up to the withering firepower of these ships. It is a somewhat comparable ship to US Navy's South Carolina class, which isn't in War Thunder, and so it's very alone in its firepower category based on the fact that it only has 2 twin main battery guns and very poor accuracy, so it's very out of its league for what it's seeing. On top of being out of its league, everything you can think of is slow on this ship. The handling, the guns, the velocity, the reload, even ranging enemy ships just feels painstakingly slow. And while the speed does get decent when you upgrade it, it's pretty slow overall, and it really handles like a brick, and it makes the stock grind just horrible for this thing. It makes it very hard to escape enemy fire. And like I said, the armor is very ineffective against most things that you see at the tier, and it also has no torpedo protection, which definitely doesn't help it. Anything that shoots you will basically do damage, even destroyers, and actually destroyers will even detonate you. It doesn't even have enough armor to help with that. It does get underwater torpedo tubes, which just shouldn't even be bothered with, as they're fairly useless and just add to the detonation chance. Like I was saying earlier, it only has 2 twin main batteries, and they're probably the worst in the game per the number. And on top of that, the angles of fire that are on these main battery guns are pretty poor. And they're also not armored very well, so these cruisers and destroyers that you're facing will also take out your main battery guns. On top of that, if you want to continue the down votes, these are probably some of the most inaccurate guns you can find in the game, and the shell penetration when they do hit is very inconsistent. So it really doesn't get any upsides. Even the shell velocity is a little wonky and slower than the heavy cruisers, it feels like. The ship does get a fairly large amount of secondaries, but it has to be basically broadside to use them all. They all have a very slow reload for some reason, and they all get really easily damaged by enemy fire, so sometimes you'll just be sailing around with no secondaries to fire back with because it's not worth repairing them. It's just a crew loss. So the secondaries on top of that, there's also a bunch of different calibers mixed in on them, and the 4.7-inch secondaries that are mounted on the ship have shell arcs that you could probably start a space program with, so they're really not effective at long range. And on top of that, the AI gunners that are standing on top of your main turrets are massively inaccurate. I don't think these things could hit a target that was, you know, rubbing up against your ship. So my overall rating for this thing is a 1 out of 10. They keep moving it down in battle rating, but it probably still would be terrible at 4.0. Rounding off our 5.7 lineup is the Aoba. This cruiser sets the starting precedent for the Japanese heavy cruisers, and after this they will all look somewhat similar to Aoba. So the ship overall is fast, and while the turns are long, it is very maneuverable for her size and responds fairly quickly to your controls, so it makes it very great at dodging fire at range. The armor as well is fairly effective against light cruiser and smaller guns, and it can bounce heavy shells, but I definitely wouldn't plan on them tanking it. One of the downsides you'll find on this ship are the magazines are pretty easy for enemies to find, which is a fairly common theme with the Japanese cruisers due to their turret layouts. But on this ship, the magazines are also fairly well protected by your torpedo bulges, which does help out a little bit, especially if you're not quite used to how the ship handles. As per her anti-aircraft, it's decent at close range, but it lacks a lot of punch and range to quickly finish off planes before they do drop their bombs, so most likely any kills you will get by it is in revenge. The turrets do turn decently fast for a heavy Japanese cruiser turret, and the armor on them is actually pretty decent for the tier, so you won't find them just getting obliterated by any passing shell. Another downside is the ship only has 6 main battery guns with a slower rate of fire than most of the other ships you can face, so it can feel a little bit underwhelming at times. And the rear turret has somewhat poor angles of fire due to the life rafts mounted on deck and the shielding around the torpedoes, so it definitely doesn't really help with that. Although the target acquisition on this ship is fairly quick due to the addition of radar on it, and the shells that it gets can basically penetrate anything that it sees easily, and they have good velocity and are very accurate. So great for taking out enemy magazines if they happen to be sailing in a straight line and you know how to aim them. The ship does get the same secondaries as Furutaka, so they're decent under 10 kilometers but easily destroyed, and they lack the batteries and rate of fire of other ships you might see at its tier. As per the torpedoes, it does get 2 quad launchers, 1 per side with Type 93s, though they do have poor angles of fire, but it's still worth it to get them down range and see if they hit anything. My rating overall is a 7 out of 10. It feels like a very improved Furutaka and a taste of what is to come. Upwards and onwards to 6.0, we have the Tone, or Tone, however it's pronounced. It is bigger and faster than Aoba, but it can see battleships. So it has some upsides and downsides there, obviously. The turns are wider and longer due to its length and speed than its predecessor, and the turret layout that it has makes it fairly easy to find its magazines, as all 4 turrets are on the front of its ship. So any stray shell that happens to hit your bow area has a very good chance of finding your magazines because they're all stacked in one location. On the flip side, the aft end of your ship is fairly empty, leaving a lot of space for you to take shots and not take a ton of module damage outside of maybe losing a bit of your speed, which you have a lot to lose. The armor can feel fairly flimsy against larger guns or sustained fire, but like I said, it's a fairly maneuverable ship and very fast. As per torpedo protection, the bulges that it does have don't seem to help a lot with how long the ship is, and it tends to flood or take heavy damage from torpedoes fairly consistently. But it does have a lot of anti-aircraft firepower for a Japanese cruiser, although, like it has seen with its predecessors, it's close range and lacks its alpha strike potential to take out planes as soon as they get near. As for the ship's firepower itself, it does add one more turret over its predecessor, which helps a little bit with the feeling of being underpowered compared to other ships that it's seeing, though the configuration of the turrets is somewhat odd with all the turrets sitting in the front of your ship. The angles that the turrets can fire at aren't terrible, but you can't fire at all if the enemy is directly behind your ship. And you still lose half your firepower when you're swapping sides, whether you're dodging or just flipping the ship around to go a different direction, as the super firing turret doesn't rotate a full 360 degrees, which is a bit weird to me. The ammo characteristics that these guns are firing are the exact same as the rest of the Japanese heavy cruisers and the same as you've seen before, though at this tier you'll find out that they somewhat struggle against battleships, but like I said, they are laser accurate, so if you find a spot on a battleship that you know you can damage, you can definitely hit it. The secondaries are now upgraded to twin mounts, same guns as Isuzu, so they're more or less for morale at this point. And for your torpedo suite, you get 2 triple launchers per sides, once again with Type 93s. They are fairly workable with their angles, and they have a good range of fire to the rear, so they're very good if you're kiting away from stuff or spinning around to go the other way and waiting for your main batteries to come around. Overall, the setup of this ship makes it great for kiting at range, and the torpedoes absolutely farm battleships that at this point they haven't learned to maneuver. They're still early on in their battleship grind, so it makes for easy targeting. And one other thing that I noticed with this ship is it doesn't have planes, even though it does have catapults. And at this tier, since you're not seeing destroyers or PT boats as much that tend to take the caps, it's actually kind of useful to have a plane to send off and do that on your own and get yourself the points without actually having to drive your ship all the way over to some far off cap point. Overall, my rating is 7 out of 10. It's fun, and the AA is certainly a surprise for most players, but it's also a weird ship to use due to the layout. Up next in our trio of 6.0 cruisers is the light cruiser Suzuya. This ship is continuing the trend of high speeds and couples it with quick, responsive turns, which is certainly a surprise for her size. The armor on the ship does work fairly well against light cruisers and does bounce heavy cruiser shells every once in a while, but if a battleship looks at you, you're better off trying to maneuver and not trusting your armor to hold up to it. On top of that, your anti-aircraft suite is very minimal, and at high tier this hurts you because people have learned to use planes and they do tend to like to revenge bomb stuff, so not having the anti-aircraft hurts more than you would think. The torpedo bulges on the ship do cover it fairly adequately, but tend to not hold up to most hits at the tier, so it's better off just not taking torpedoes in the first place. As per your firepower, you get triple 155mm torpedo mounts, and the extra mount over Tone's 4 makes it feel quite powerful. It doesn't quite get the rate of fire that you expect though if you're coming from a game where light cruisers always have that 6-second rate of fire. This one actually only gets one more salvo off per minute than the heavy cruisers, so you're not seeing a massive change in your reload times. The turret layout, however, does work fairly well, despite once again making the magazines easy to find and hit, because it gives your turrets pretty good angles of fire. The rear turrets are only slightly blocked by their catapults, and the shells do have similar velocities to heavy cruiser shells, but less pen, so you don't really have to relearn your aiming with it. This ship is quite amazing against light targets, and the shells can whittle down heavier targets. Unless it's a battleship, it really struggles to pen those. So it's very effective at destroying modules on enemy ships and just piecemealing them down till, you know, they sink. As per your secondary suite, you get the same secondaries as Tone, so yeah, it's just for morale. And you also get the same torpedo setup with good rear angles for kiting, but the launchers have no forward arcs, so you have to go fully broadside if you're not already kiting away from something. Overall, once again, you have a great ranged kiting ship that's able to very effectively dodge incoming fire, and so my rating for this is going to be a 7 out of 10. I have really missed the 155 Mogami that I used to play in World of Warships. And speaking of Mogami, she will be rounding out our 6.0 lineup with a fairly short review actually, because she's pretty much the exact same as her sister ship Suzuya. All she did really was trade a tiny bit of speed for her double 203mm mounts instead of the triple 155mm that Suzuya had. And while they upgraded the guns, they didn't really add any anti-aircraft firepower, which once again hurts it at high tier. These guns are the same as the other heavy cruisers and use the same shells, and the 5 turrets that it has makes it pretty devastating when coupled with the accuracy and, like I said, aiming for magazines with these ships. The torpedoes are also still the same, still devastating to basically anything on the sea, and it's still a very excellent kiting platform. These ships tend to lose going head-to-heads at closer ranges, but if you just sit out and use your laser accurate shells, your low velocity, and once again your torpedoes, you'll absolutely decimate the enemy teams. Overall, my rating for Mogami is an 8 out of 10. She's got the moves and the firepower to make her dangerous. Shifting up to 6.3, we have the first Japanese battleship, which is Settsu. I do have to put a disclaimer into this review. Mine doesn't have the engine or rudder upgrades. I skipped a little bit of this ship to get to Kongo, so I'll try not to base it too much on that. This ship does play a lot like Ikoma Mark II, but now it is actually facing other battleships. Once again, everything is slow, it maneuvers like a brick, the guns are very slow to swing around, and it really lacks any effective anti-air as well. So it's basically a sitting duck if a plane wants to come give you a visit. It is slightly better armored than Ikoma, but it does get crushed by most other battleships that you see, and having turrets near the center of your ship, in arcade battles especially, can be fairly detrimental, as the arcade aiming system is pointing the enemy team basically at the center of your ship, which is, lo and behold, exactly where your magazines are for those 2 guns. To wrap up your armor review, this ship also has no torpedo protection, and that especially hurts at these tiers where any torpedo you see is going to be pretty devastating. As per the firepower on this ship, the guns are pretty much the exact same that you saw in Ikoma. They are doubling the number of broadside, which helps with the poor accuracy, and the shells are slightly better in all regards, but overall it's pretty inconsistent with its penetration, damage, and obviously accuracy. My rating for this thing overall is a 3 out of 10. It does at least feel more like a battleship than Ikoma did. And finally we get to the current top battle rating 7.0, and to lead it off we have the Fuso. This thing is an awesome battleship to top the tree out on currently, though I did say this pre-Mutsu being added, so maybe Mutsu might change that. And for such a heavy looking ship, she actually moves decently quick in the water, though it's certainly nowhere close to the speed you were used to with the Japanese cruisers. Her rudder does respond fairly quickly, but she does have long, slow turns due to the overall length of the ship. But due to the speed she has and her turning radius, you can actually use them to dodge enemy fire. She does bleed off speed fast enough and turn sharp enough that at long range, if an enemy battleship targets you, you can just stop your ship and turn, or reverse depending on what you want to do, and you actually have a pretty good chance of throwing off the enemy aim, which does help with the turret layout of the ship, which I will get into a little bit later. As per the anti-aircraft suite, the Fuso does have a lot of small caliber, close range anti-aircraft, and like all the other ships in the Japanese line, it really shouldn't be relied upon, because if anything it's just going to be a revenge kill. The ship does overall have very strong armor against most things that it sees, though the mid-mounted turrets are a detriment. Like I said before, with arcade battles it points the enemy team to the middle of your ship to aim, and that is basically where your magazines are for those two center mounted turrets. So once again, if you want to use your speed and maneuverability to dodge that, it's highly suggested. The ship does have decent torpedo protection overall, but it also does tend to detonate if you do get hit by a torpedo due to your scattered turret layout. Basically anywhere a torpedo is going to hit you, it's going to find one of your magazines. And the turret survivability is actually pretty good otherwise. They do seem to survive a lot of shell hits, and they do have similar turrets to the rest of the 36cm armed Japanese battleships, so you won't be worried about losing your firepower to a couple stray shells. Speaking of the firepower, this thing has amazing guns. They turn 1 degree per second less than the heavy cruisers, so it's really not too slow for battleship caliber guns, and they do have pretty good angles of fire, so you can keep your ship fairly armored when you're brawling other battleships. You have 6 twin turrets overall, and they feel absolutely amazing to use. They initially get semi-armor piercing, but it's nicer than dealing with high explosive as your stock shell in a battleship. Overall, your shells have good velocity and great accuracy. They tend to penetrate virtually anything you shoot at, and once again, they're great shells for shooting at magazines under the waterline, and they will wreck enemy battleships if you know where to find it. The shells are shared with Issei and Kongo, so your 7.0 lineup won't have different lead times, and your aim will be easier to learn. You won't have to relearn yourself for each ship. The secondaries on this thing are numerous and have a decent rate of fire and great angles of fire, and they also have similar velocity to your main guns, which makes them great for targeting, but overall they tend to lack penetration and damage, so at the tier they're really not going to be doing much for you, other than letting you know that your lead is still good before you fire your main battery guns and use up that reload. So my rating for the Fuso is a 9 out of 10. This thing is a mag detonating monster. Up next in our 7.0 battleship lineup we have the Hyuga. This thing feels like it should actually be Japan's 6.7 battleship, not really fully top tier, because while it's not much slower, it feels a lot more lethargic than Fuso, and the turns feel a lot longer, though that may be due to its slower speed, and it does have a lot of other downsides that just doesn't make it feel good as a top tier ship. It does still bleed speed well like the Fuso, so you can dodge shells at long range, though with the slower speed it's not quite as effective. On top of that, the ship has virtually no anti-aircraft, which makes it a sitting duck for everything at top tier. And the armor is overall weaker than Fuso's. It tends to take a lot more damage overall, and it also has less crew, making it die a lot faster. And once again, you have the typical issues with the center mounted turrets in arcade battles. I'm not going to reiterate that 900 times. On top of the lack of armor, it also has no torpedo protection at top tier and tends to detonate like Fuso due to the scattered turret layout, which you're not stopping any part of that explosion in this ship. It does, firepower wise, have the same guns as Fuso, but it does get weaker penetrating shells, though at least it does start with semi-armor piercing instead of high explosive, making the grind a little bit easier. As per the turret angles, you do tend to have to almost be broadside to bring every main battery to bear, as it tends to get blocked by its own superstructures. It's definitely a detriment at these higher tiers when you're facing off against battleships. And the shells themselves tend to be a little bit more finicky with penetration than Fuso's versus other battleships, but they aren't as frustrating to use like Settsu or Ikoma's shells. Thankfully, these shells do share in the good velocity and accuracy as the other battleship shells in the line, and so they're still great for mag detonations when they do decide to penetrate. As per the secondaries on this ship, they are a lot more useful than Fuso's, with a lot more pen, and they do come stock with semi-armor piercing, saving you the research. The secondaries will pen larger targets like battleships and cause decent damage consistently, despite them being a smaller caliber than Fuso's, and they do boast a fairly good rate of fire. They do have mainly forward firing arcs on this ship, and while that can be detrimental when you're kiting, it can bring most of them to bear in most situations. As for the underwater torpedoes, yeah, they're once again not worth bringing. It's not worth it. They're just going to add to your detonation chance, and you're probably not going to use them or get much effect out of them, even if you do. The other thing that's a downside for this ship is that it does get no float plane, which could come in pretty handy when you're so slow at these higher tiers, so it's definitely a negative as per this ship. Overall, my rating is 6 out of 10. The experience of being up tiered while you're at the top tier, but it does have good secondaries to make up for it. Up next we have the speed queen of the Japanese battleships, which is the Kongo, also at 7.0 if you haven't guessed. This thing is basically cruiser speed in a battleship, but it definitely is not a brawler. It's somewhat paid for that speed in its armor. It is a very fast ship if you haven't guessed, and very responsive to turns, but when you do turn at speed it rolls very heavily, which can prevent you from targeting your main batteries until the ship actually settles back down. This ship also does have enough anti-aircraft to be dangerous at close range, but it still won't prevent most attacks on you. And while it's not quite as armored as the other battleships in the line, the speed definitely makes up for it in being able to dodge enemy fire, or at least get out of their firing arc if you can get behind an island or something like that. The torpedo protection is present on this ship, but I found that when you do take a torpedo in it, it tends to want to flood the ship out fully and causes the ship to want to roll over when hit, and actually battleship fire will do this to it sometimes. It's very finicky with this ship. As per the firepower on Kongo, the 4 double gun main batteries can feel a little bit undergunned for the tier when you're facing stuff with 6 main batteries or so, but they do share all the characteristics of Fuso's guns, so they are actually pretty good guns. The guns also have good firing arcs, though the super firing rear turret does get blocked by the catapult launcher and the tower that is on the last turret on the ship when it's trying to fire straight back, which I found a little bit weird about it. But overall, you get the same shells as Fuso and Issei, so you're sharing in their good penetration, velocity, and accuracy. But you also get the same mediocre secondaries as Fuso, and in smaller numbers, so they're really just for morale while you're waiting for your main batteries to reload. On top of that, you do have a couple automatic secondaries on this ship, but they're really just there to make noise. So, overall rating, 7 out of 10. It's basically a heavy cruiser. Rounding out the ships that I have unlocked at 7.0 is Issei. I really haven't played this battleship much at all, as I didn't think War Thunder saved your earned EXP for when they added in a new ship. If I did know that they did do this, I would have ground it out and probably had not Nagato, Mutsu by now. But every post I found on the internet said that they didn't, so that's a little bit of a complaint from me. As for the ship itself, Issei has slightly less crew than Hyuga, but gains more armor, speed, and torpedo protection. But she does still share the same problem of having center-mounted guns, especially in arcade mode. She did get a handful of 25mm anti-aircraft mounts over Hyuga, but it's not really enough to count. Both primary and secondary guns on this ship start with semi-armor piercing, and the main guns get the same armor piercing as Fuso and Kongo, so overall it's a very good setup on this ship. The main batteries also got a very improved forward firing arcs, so even though the rearward arcs are still poor, it makes the guns a lot more useful while keeping your ships angled to deflect that enemy battleship firepower. So overall, I'm going to give this ship a rating of 7 out of 10. I'm giving it one more point for Hyuga for now. Despite me not having upgrades, it just feels a lot more put together than Hyuga did, and a lot more fun to use, I guess. Now, while I don't have it unlocked because it was just released, I did want to throw in a tidbit about Mutsu at the end here. The War Thunder post does do a decent job of showing off the ship, but I don't think it puts it into perspective compared to the other battleships in the tree. So armor-wise, there is a fairly significant increase in armor over the other Japanese battleships with this one, though at least when stock, it has a lower crew than all the other Japanese battleships so far, so that's a little interesting. And it also doesn't have any torpedo protection at top tier. Obviously this is an early version of the Nagato, so that makes a little bit of sense. It has absolutely no anti-aircraft guns, so any plane is going to have a field day with you. And it also doesn't have a float plane, which once again is a negative at top tier. When fully upgraded, its top speed will be similar to Fuso, though it does right now, per stock, have long turns. So we'll see what that looks like when it gets upgraded. As per its secondaries, it does get the same secondaries as Issei and Hyuga, so that's actually a good sign for your stock grind because it still gets semi-armor piercing stock, and these are the secondaries that were doing a ton of damage to enemy ships. On top of your great secondary firepower, you do have the largest main batteries in game so far, with the highest amount of penetration, so these are certainly going to be interesting to use once I get them unlocked. When upgraded, it seems like the turrets will turn with a similar speed to the other Japanese battleships, so that's also a good sign. The one thing I kind of have to hold against this ship is it does start with high explosive as its basic shell, but I guess it does have very high velocity, so we'll see how that works out for it. Without a doubt, at the very least, the high amount of secondaries starting off with semi-armor piercing will help out with the stock grind, so I'm not overly worried about the stock grind being painful. And as usual, it's probably not worth it to bother with the underwater torpedoes, as they tend to kind of be very situational and just add to your detonation chance when something is shooting at you from long range. And I can't really give this one a rating yet because that would be unfair for me to just rate my experience with test drives, so stay tuned for when I get it unlocked. And for now, that is the end of my War Thunder Japanese Naval Line review. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it if you did make it this far, and I'd be curious to see what your comments are as to if you think I got some of this wrong, or if you'd like to see something added in the future as per review point on these ships. Either way, good luck out there, and I'll see you in the next one.